I gave this more universalist name, 25 lost years of a most ambitious period, whereby the world seemed to be going along some very well defined and pure lines. Many people have a liking for the magic of numbers and remember some round dates. The 2014 was the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Great War, and suddenly we saw the events which were quite unexpected. Last year was also full of different dates. This year brings us back to our novel history. 25 years ago, the Soviet Union collapsed in December. We shall be what kind of anniversary this is, and I think the attitude towards this fact has never been clearly stated, because on the one side there seems to be great nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and on the other side we are seeing the Memorial Center of Humanism in Katerinburg, and indeed the government that has seen to the power today. None of the people who are in government today would have ever been able to make it to the fulminant top of the Russian hierarchy without the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this dichotomy, this contradiction which exists, is with us at all times in our attitudes towards the Soviet past. And this is probably not surprising, because while we may think in different ways about the so-called major geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century being the Soviet Union. And I think that I disagree personally with these words of the Russian president, because I believe personally that the Great War, the World War I, was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. But indeed, it led to great tectonic shifts in Eurasia and elsewhere in the world, and it is clearly an event of great importance, and all repercussions as well as the consequences of these events are not yet well understood. Many people have been surprised as to how the Soviet Union collapsed peacefully compared to, say, Yugoslavia. And of course, the nightmare of the Soviet Union dismantled violently was a nightmare of a whole generation. But unfortunately, 1991 was not the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but even if it's not the beginning, it was a midpoint in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it certainly did not end the process of the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the so-called frozen conflicts are periodically reheat, and there is no reason not to believe. There is no reason to believe that this area, which was once called Soviet space or Soviet bloc, will suddenly become peaceful in the next several years. Another date that we are remembering this year, the 15th year anniversary, where the 9/11 terrorist acts, the planes and the terrorist attack becoming a great shock for the American society, because primarily this foe coming from the blue was not a conventional foe, and this unconventional attack caused a great psychological trauma and reaction, which initiated a chain of events and somewhat impulsive actions, as a result of which the problem was not removed. The problem that gave birth to this terrorism was only exacerbated. And the tendencies that in the 1990s seemed to be sporadic or spontaneous. The challenges and the risks that were emerging in different parts of the world, especially in the West, and Russia was more of immersed in its own problems, but they were perceived by many in the West as some residues of the former problems, because the major problem, the problem of the Cold War, was apparently resolved. And so when in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania the U.S. embassies were blown up, this did not lead to any major political shifts. And so the world had to go through the 9/11 nightmare for this shocking performance. I beg pardon for this oxymoron of this visual syndrome, a visual symbol of the collapse of illusions. So after this event, the world started to spin into a somewhat different direction, even though this had already started several years back. Yet another date, which we're remembering this year, is the so-called 5th anniversary of the so-called Arab Spring, which was in many ways the consequence of 9/11 terrorist attacks and the U.S. reaction to the 9/11 attacks. But the Arab Spring, I think, became some sort of a endpoint of this 25-year cycle, because when the events in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere started, many intellectuals, including the European intellectuals, were welcoming these events, saying that here's how the 1989 of Eastern Europe is finally coming to the Middle East. And before the Arab Spring, the Arab world seemed to be institutionally very stagnating or even stayed. And so this great expectations of the democratic transit. Unfortunately, this was another lost illusion, or another illusion, but this became some sort of a threshold for the expectations and the hopes of the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. The broken trough that I started with, alluding to this Pushkin's Tale of the Golden Fish, is this trough was quite large insofar as the different countries and even continents tried to be squeezed into it. And the inspiration in the second half of the 1980s was, of course, great. As we listened to our colleague from the Council of Europe, who was also remembering the idea of the family of the European democracies, the idea of the European home was, I think, first used as a political term by Mikhail Gorbachev. And I don't think that Mikhail Gorbachev should be viewed as a idealist and romanticist. I think that he was quite pragmatic in introducing this new political thinking, which led to this idea of the common European home, which I think was very enthusiastically received in Europe. At that time, in the 1980s, it seemed that everything is moving ahead correctly. This metaphor of the common European home where the families coexist, cohabitate peacefully and co-manage the property. And as I perceive the ideas that were behind Mr. Gorbachev's phrases were that the former foes would be that were becoming friendly neighbors and co-participate in this management of the European condominium, if I may use the word. And so through this common architecture of both the Soviet and the Western designers, this concept would emerge. And clearly, there was a lot of rhetoric about convergence, about the no zero-sum game results, and the new Europe, which should build on the and predicated upon the general perception of Europe as the nucleus of the world order. And of course, this may be different today, but at that time, Europe was still believed to be the main theater of international politics. However, the currents turned awry, and the general perception of this system that must be must be supported by 2 feet. This did not work because the Soviet Union entered the mortal and lethal economic and political crisis, and clearly the Soviet leadership and the Soviet government was no longer in any position to continue building this common European home. And even though the Paris Charter for the new Europe was signed, the flaming periphery of the Soviet Union and the devastating economic crisis of the Soviet system precluded the Soviet government from moving in this direction any farther. So when the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, it turned out that the idea of the European home and the world and the new political order that Mikhail Gorbachev spoke back to 1986, these ideas stayed, but they were implemented by others. In January of 1992, President George Bush the Senior, in his last State of the Union address, spoke at the Congress and said that by God's will we won the Cold War. And these dots were put, although there was, of course, no act of capitulation, and even in Russia, believed that we won. But in terms of international politics, there was no perception. In the West, it was widely accepted that the Soviet Union disappeared as a smoke disappearing in the sky. And as the victors always get this privilege, the victors got the right to shape the world they wanted it to see, or they wanted it to be. To this very era or period in history, we believe this well-used, almost cliché title of Francis Fukuyama's book about the end of history, and the general perception as to when this ideology would be taken and extrapolated to the rest of the world. Not because this ideology of the West is the most proper and correct one. And while everybody understood that it would take time to install these Western foundations or values in different places, including Russia. And even though there's a lot of talk in Russia as to how much we were cheated or deceived, this runs contrary to the political discourse in Russia in those years when it was widely believed that eventually the Western ideology should and would take root in Russia. At about the same time, an article was published by the well-known U.S. Commentator Charles Krauthammer, which was even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unipolar world, whereby the U.S. would be able to shape the world as they see fit. And if you reread this article today, it will not seem to you as primitive as many authors believe it to be. Krauthammer, indeed, while proclaiming the victory of America in this conflict, believed that this unipolar moment would not be long, but would only develop for about 20 to 25 years. And when you read this article today, when you reread it today, you understand how perceptive he was in this article, is that this unipolar world period would not be very protracted, and the rest of the world's history in the ensuing years would depend on how the U.S. managed this 25-year window that it has been given. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, which only vindicated the lines that were written about it in the last years of its existence, and the world seemed to accept some sort of a clear pattern. And while it was understood that it would take time for us to understand where to move, how to move forward, but at least there was an understanding how we would move forward. In the past years, the end of the Soviet bloc in Europe led to great changes in Latin America. The dismantling of the juntas in many countries, and in Latin America, in South America today, we don't see dictatorships. Africa started to change. Some of the cannibal dictators left. The apartheid regime broke up in South Africa, in Southeast Asia. Changes ensued. Military dictatorship ended in South Korea, in Taiwan, and elsewhere. So there was the great stimulus towards the world becoming a more democratic place, and in terms of liberal democratic changes. In that same trend, in that same stream, there was Russia had its place, Russia had its say, which at that time could not, while it could not shape its vision, and I think that this is still the case, that Russia cannot shape its vision up until today, but an attempt to make Russia a part of the common trend, which was visualized in different ways, including the general economic measures, and I think that the history of the Russian privatization has is still perceived as a great harm, did a great harm to the moral credibility of the political leadership of the country. But what is important for that period of time, and we're seeing it today, is that with the end of the Soviet Union, The period of reflection and intellectual work unfortunately ended. Those who remember the last years of the existence of the Soviet Union would also remember very heated debates, intellectual deliberations, and public discourse between the different wings of the Russian society. Many of the representatives of the so-called progressive milieu were in favor of the Democrats, and it seemed that those who are the opponents are people who are trying to inhibit the development of the Soviet Union. Sometimes when we read some of the articles in those years, some of the opponents had their point. When I was a student, we were going to support Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Yeltsin, and we were afraid of the reactionaries. But some of the reactionaries today do not seem to be so reactionary.
Well, there were discussions of different quality about what was going to happen. The disintegration of the Soviet Union played a catastrophic role because all the discussions were finished, everything dissipated, and actually the task for the state and for each individual was to survive, and there was nothing much to discuss. Of course, you may discuss historical ways when you are not hungry and when you have work to do. And the discussion ended. Because getting back to the international trend issue, the discussion was over. We took the way of a civilized world market economy, democracy, and let us move forward. Now we understand what kind of the road was that. But during the 90s, under these chaotic conditions in our economy, in our politics, in our intellectual endeavors. And then there came the next period. It turned out a little bit better. Life was getting better. And again, it was not the proper time for discussion. And the society, distracted from ruminations by dramatic crisis, would never get back to these ruminations, because after all, when the crisis was over, the society wanted to have some rest after being tired, and that was the period of the 2000. It was kind of intellectual respite, which brought about many interesting things to us. After that, there came the next stage when everything turned out to be unclear, not only in this country, but in the world. And actually, we didn't know which way we go. What is the final goal? And September 11th was emotional shock for everybody. But at the same time, the September 11th was the completion of the first stage. And you may take decades 91, 2001, that's the first stretch, when you felt that everything was clear, America-centric world, Western model, and we have to accommodate ourselves somehow. After September 11, it was not that clear, because not all the world greeted it. And actually, it made some, or it took some radical measures. But what shall we do about it? To stop and think, like Mikhail Sulman said, would have been useful, but people didn't do it. And the American administration decided to challenge terrorists, and they tripled the solution of promoting democracy the way they preferred. In the Middle East, in the first place, And that's actually the last place in the world to promote democracy, but that's where they decided to do it. So the next stage from 2001 to 2011, well, this is the Arab Spring. That's the erosion of your ideas that everything is going well. And now we are in the middle of the third stage, which to me means understanding that the idea of the 80s didn't work. We have to think things over. So after this intellectual respite and spiritual respite in the rich years after that, there was a certain sobering and understanding that we are moving the wrong way. Conditionally, it may be connected, well, with the Putin's return on the presidential position. In 2012, 2013, before the Ukrainian crisis, I remember Putin's presentations. Pretty often he says about values, identities, culture, conservatism came to us from heaven. Well, this was, to me, quite natural in order to return to the initial discussion, which was disrupted in '91, because you have to understand what Russia is about and where it moves. Otherwise, you cannot expect positive results. Again, this proper message or impulse was destroyed by the Ukrainian crisis, and then our society came into the regime of mobilization. Enemies are around, enemies at the gate, and you have to protect yourself. What we see around now is the fragments of this bowl which was broken, or hub which was broken, and there were certain ideals on which the Moscow School and the European Council were founded. What seemed to us, well, unreachable but properly functioning. It was a good model, a good example. European Union as a prototype of future organization of the world and prototype of how international relations should operate. Now it's difficult to appeal to this. You can't say, let us do it this way. It was already mentioned here by Mikhail Sulman in a very interesting, reticent but clear way, meaning that the European Union is now in the systemic crisis at multi-level nature, and the implication is a new model of integration is in store. I disagree that the European Union would disappear. Well, it's better to keep it the way it is, but it will be different. It will be transformed into something else, and the transformation will be deep enough. Probably it will be smaller. I don't know about Great Britain referendum in June, how it will end, but probably for the first time there will be exit, because the European myth was based upon the idea that everybody wants in. Now we see that someone wants out. There are people who say we don't need it, and actually the European Union cannot expand any longer. Of course, nice words would be said not to recognize it, but now it is obvious that the borders of the European Union are set. They will not be expanded, and if they will, Well, probably some Balkan countries, but I don't know what will come out of it. Because the efficiency of institutes, of the institutes, have fallen down. The both sides of the former Iron Curtain require understanding that the ice was broken, and you have to try not to swim to the piece of ice somewhere in front of you and just catch the piece of ice which is next to you. And then you should understand which way to go. Should you swim in this water? Well, this is a very long metaphor. I mean, you can use it for a long time. And these 25 years in Russia turned out to be the times of loss. Our transit wouldn't bring us anywhere. We took a certain path which we didn't quite understand, lead us to Vasily Zharkov, who is present here. He's a good friend and colleague of mine. He has participated in the project together with Gorbachev's foundation that new perestroika is required. I sympathize with this project as a part of an intellectual landscape. I don't want to criticize things, and let us remember that this was a very noble strife, but we don't need another perestroika. Perestroika is a great and beautiful attempt which showed what may happen if you start something without understanding what you can get in the result. So this lack of understanding brought about the difficult response to the changing circumstances. And that's what you can say about this failing transit. My colleague, Professor Grigoriev, an economist, says that Russia showed the world a unique example. It turned out to be a great exporter of raw material, money, and people for the 25 years. So we found a chance of sending out everything which should be used by the country of your own. It's a separate issue why it happened so, but it's bad, and that's no doubts about it. As to our identity, we have a vacuum when we find out that, well, we have only a Victory Day celebration and nothing else can unify us. Attempts somehow at the level of the state engineering to add something to the historical pantheon. For instance, 2 years ago, Putin unveiled the monument to the heroes of the World War I, and this was an effort to return the World War I to our history as an important event. But it didn't work. Not because people didn't fight for it, didn't manage it properly, but it simply didn't work. And the victory over Napoleon was also on the agenda. 200 years when Russia was the greatest and most powerful country in the world, and it brought in certain ideals. But none of this worked. So the modern public construct does not provide for complications. It's all bad anyway, so we should not play on subtleties. As a result, It was a clean but unsuccessful experiment trying to improve Russia by inbreeding or inlaying into a certain trend to somehow to accommodate Russia to some existing trend and then to develop. So the polemics of Westerners and the soil people ended for a certain period of time by the victory of Westerners, but they failed to use it properly. So presently, everything which is connected with the Westerners is taken negatively. And in the perestroika time, we were in favor of all sorts of freedoms, but now the pendulum is getting back. And at that time, we were idealistic and naive. Presently, it is cynical and blunt darkness. We don't trust anybody. Everybody is our enemy. Everybody wants to offend us. I am a realist, and I think that the pendulum will go back again. But I don't know when, and when it will reach certain intermediate stage, which would also depend on what happens outside. And nothing beautiful happens outside. There is a systemic crisis of the European model, and we don't know how this would be resolved. As to the elections in the United States, we see that the society goes through hard times, even in the United States of America. It's kind of disappointment and confusion, and all the establishment candidates failed. Trump is a separate story, but I'm fascinated by the second person here, which is Bernie Sanders. He wouldn't win. Everybody understands it, but he's been trying to do his best, trying to catch Hillary Clinton. And the young people are happy about it. They are excited about it. I spent a week in the United States of America and I watched TV. It was kind of a show. The content is not much, but the show is wonderful. So Bernie Sanders, well, I remember this type, a professor of political economy of socialism, who says some stories about the socialism. It's not new for us, but it is new for Americans. Here comes someone who said that we need justice, and the young people who actually don't believe they would live like their parents, they would live worse, and they consider him as a messiah, and he is actually 74, and he produces lots of excitement among the young people, which is bad in itself. So evidently, the last representative of an establishment would probably become a president, which is Hillary Clinton. I have many friends in the circles of American establishment. Even people who support her say, yes, she deserves it. But nobody is enthusiastic about her, meaning, well, we have no other choice, neither drive nor ideas. And actually, on the basis of this, any originality springs up, both positive and negative. At first, the Western world took a flame and moved forward, saying, follow me. But then something, fire went down, and everybody is confused. And referring to what Mikhail Sulman said, people still do not understand that you do not have to jump into the cold water. The American establishment tries to somehow control this situation, and the most awful punishment for a politician in the Western world is referendum. Let us not ask people, because you don't know what they can say. Actually, referendum is a very ugly thing, because people do not vote for what they are asked for. But in democracy, the opinion of people should be heard. And whatever happened in the European Union twice with Denmark and Ireland, when they vote in the wrong way, and they were said, no, let us do it again. And then, for the second time, they voted properly. But it doesn't work in case of France or in case of Greece, when they definitely said no to the critical conditions, and then they agreed to worse conditions. Anyway, what we observe now in our country and in Europe and America and in the rest of the world, in China, it's different. And they also reached the limits, and some new model is required there. So these 25 years, they were not lost, because your time is never lost, because any time feeds you with lessons. But are we able to consider, to assess these lessons properly? Well, they say that somebody else's mistakes are not taken into consideration. You don't even take into consideration your own mistakes. But the important and bright period which caused the opposite results, this period makes us think about the following. The use of opportunities is a great responsibility, and if you simply lose it, it's bad. And if you abused it, and then you feel sorry that it was ever there, same as actually happened with Russia, because at first our political class cynically exchanged the great ascent to the power for itself. And of course, the people are indifferent. Evidently now you should wait for a long time when you will come to a period of new ascension